day, everybody, and welcome to this Transcending Together hot take. Hey, folks, and welcome back to my podcast. This is the second in my series of fireside chats about the economics and where we currently are, with Zach Polanski and the Green Party finally trying to get the conversation moved back into having a discussion about the shortcomings of our current economic system and why it's broken and why it's not working for everybody, and um, why we're just feeling poorer. What I'm trying to do with with this series of lectures is to have a conversation about the fundamental principles around economics, and specifically capitalism and Western free market style economics. So, in the last session, I discussed the economic flow model. Now, you don't have to have watched that in order to watch this one, but I'll put a link to it at the end of this video, so you can go and have a look at that as well. But I will be referring to that economic flow model in conjunction with the one I want to talk about today. So, on that basis, and just before I go into that, so just to be very clear, I'm approaching this. I'm using the economic theory that underpins the current economic model that we have in Western society. So, even though I am an avowed socialist, I did study economics. So this is their system. This is the free market system. This is how it works. And what we are seeing is a feature, not a bug. So, right. So let's get started. So this particular chart is the second in one of the fundamentals of economics. So you'll learn about this in Economics 101. And this looks at, if I were a manufacturer and I wanted to sell a product, then I need to figure out, okay, how much should I sell this product for? Now, obviously, I've got built-in costs, so it's going to cost me a certain amount to make it, but then I'm going to want to make a profit. So the question is, or the underlying principle is that the cheaper something is, the more people will want that particular thing. So, and the more expensive it is, the fewer people will want that particular thing. So, at a very high price, you'll have a very low level of what we call demand for the product. But at a lower price, you'll have more demand for a product. So if we were to put this on a chart, it basically looks like this. So this is what we call the demand curve. And this basically, if you were to map it out on average, it would look something like that, in simplistic terms. So that's so based on that, I might model around, run some focus groups, and have a look and see, okay, how do I actually make this work? What is the right price for something? Now, it's also worth bearing in mind that the more demand there is for a particular product, the more my competitors will want to come in and supply the same product. So then what happens is the amount that I can make is constrained by the capacity of my factory. So other companies come into the market, and so therefore more and more of this product starts becoming available. And as we know, the more of an item that there is, the lower the price. that we can fetch for that particular product. And this is what we call the supply curve. And this illustrates basically that point, that the higher the price that I can set for an item, the more the incentive for competitors to supply into the market. And the sweet spot where these two intersect is what we call price equilibrium. So those are just some basic concepts around the supply and demand curve. As I said, fundamental economic theory 101 here. So that's me as the manufacturer. But how do we figure out how much money people have got to spend on a particular thing? So for that, we need to look at the economic flow model that I discussed in my last video. And by way of a recap, this is just the basic fundamentals of the economic flow model. And as I said, if you want to go into more detail, understand exactly how this works, that's in the other video. But for the purposes of this, I want to focus on where individuals' money comes from. So we get it from the labor that we sell to the companies who pay us money in return. They give us salaries, and we can also sell our labor to the government, public sector workers, and so forth. So just based on that, we have a limiting factor in as much as the people can only have as much money as companies are willing to pay them. And this is interesting in terms of what we discussed in the other video, because obviously if you're not paying people money, like if you replace everybody with AI, how are they going, if there's no money in the households, how are they going to buy stuff? So that's an interesting conundrum. But as I said, covered in the other video. So the limiting factor then is the amount of salaries a household. So the collective income of a household is basically what we call the household's buying power. But it's not the only place a household can get money from in order to buy stuff. They can also borrow money from the bank. So this would be credit cards, home loans, vehicle finance, all that kind of stuff, Klarna. And as I've illustrated here, you can see not all the households will qualify to actually get money, to get loans. So, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but just in simplistic terms, some of the households can access loans. There's a cost for accessing that loan, and that cost is the interest you have to pay to the bank in order to service that loan. But then now that they've got that money, what that means is that they can now use it to buy goods and services. So they could, as I said, use it to buy a house, use it to buy a car. They could use credit cards to go on holiday. Basically, they can use it to buy stuff. So that increases the purchasing power of the households that qualify. And what do we know about the purchasing power of the household? Well, what would happen is if you increase the purchasing power within the household, that means that you increase demand. And what that means is prices of everything will go up. Now, in simple terms, this is inflation, but I've got a really clever way of talking about inflation, which we'll get to later. Now, this all looks fantastic if you are on the supply curve, because you're supplying stuff. It means you can now sell them for a higher amount. And the best illustration of this is houses. So we hear about, the housing market, it's It's so high. And the reason behind that is very simply is home loans. And if we think about home loans, 20 years ago, um, they stimulated, they messed around with the demand side by offering people 100% mortgages. So basically, anyone who qualified, you want to buy a £200,000 house, here's £200,000. Over time, that sort of whittled down as the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Bank of England were sort of like, okay, we need to tinker again because house prices are going up too fast and people are buying too much stuff, so inflation's going up, and household indebtedness is going up, and all this is a terrible thing. So they squeezed it down. They said, okay, well, let's just give people 80% of a mortgage on 80% of the value of the property. It also it's also worth pointing out that the banks themselves, they're also saying, I'm not really sure, if I give you 100%, if I let you buy that house for 200,000 and then you default, can I get my 200,000 that I've lent you back? So the fact that the total value that you can actually put on a mortgage is also a function of how comfortable the banks are that they could recover that if they needed to actually take hold of the property and sell it. So that also factors into that. What we've then seen is that, so we've gone from 100% to 80% to, well, let's tinker with it again and let's just offer them an interest-only mortgage. So there the banks are saying, okay, as long as you pay me interest, I'll lend you the money, but the house remains mine. And at some future point, I'm going to expect you to take out a mortgage and start paying back some of the capital on this. So that means now more of those families, the little purple guys, can enter the market. So what does it do? It pushes up demand, pushes up the price. And it's now got to the ridiculous point where you don't even buy the house itself, you just buy a share of the house. And you still pay rent to the bank or whoever the freeholder of that property is. So you're paying interest to the bank, usually, well, on your percentage value of the house, the portion that you're buying, and you're paying rent to the freeholder. So it's quite interesting in Afrikaans. The Afrikaans word for interest is rente. So maybe the Afrikaners are a little bit ahead on that one, but like Springbok rugby team. Anyway, back to our presentation. So, so we've established that if you increase demand, you're going to increase the price. So how do we get stability in the housing market? Well, this is something that we are hearing a lot about at the moment, and this is increasing the amount of homes that are available. So in doing this, what we're talking about is increasing the supply in the market. So people keep saying, oh, we need to build more houses, build, baby, build, according to Labour. So we need more and more and more houses. They're right up to a point, but there's an interesting stat that I'll get to later around the supply of houses. But be that as it may, if you increase supply, now there's two intersection points that you can see immediately, but I'm going to come to those just after this next point. The next point I want to make is that what you see is if you increase supply, you do still have an opportunity to increase demand. So what that implies is that we can actually allow, if we increase supply, we allow more people into the market, and it doesn't necessarily affect the original price based on the old demand curve. So to me, that's kind of illustrates that, the banks can get in on it. There is space to increase demand. But really, what you want to be looking at is trying to keep the house prices where they are. If we look at if we were to release a whole lot of new houses into the market as it currently exists with all of its overstimulated demand, that means we could actually sell far more houses but keep the prices the same. So you might look at that and say, "Oh, okay, that's quite a good win," but you're forgetting all the people that fell off the bus, fell off the wagon earlier when the prices all went up and couldn't qualify for that credit. They're still excluded from the market. So you're still only selling into the same base, which is pretty much why the price stays more or less where it is. What's more interesting is if you increase supply based on the original demand, so demand absent the intervention of the banks, so just based purely on householders' purchasing power, so the incomes of the people in the house, then you can actually bring the house prices down by increasing supply. And obviously, the more you increase supply, the lower the prices go. Now, lots of people, I can see you sort of having a freak out and saying, but you can't let house prices come down. We're always told, oh, house prices are falling. House prices are falling. It's a bit like Chicken Little and the sky is falling. But actually, there's an interesting thought experiment I'd like to do with you on this. So let's decide whether house prices have gone up really in real terms. Is the value of that property worth today what they want you to buy it for? So let's have a look. So we've got a house in 2008, according to the Office of National Statistics. The average price of a home in the UK, or I think it was England and Wales, was £168,973. In 2025, the most recent figures show that that is now 323,159. So that's 91% or almost double. Over 17 years, though, bear that in mind. So actually, it's gone up 5% per annum, which sounds doable. Now, what's important to understand, there's two key points here. One is I haven't included the cost of the interest on, let's say you got a mortgage for £168,000 in 2008. You would have paid about £42,000 worth of interest. I've excluded that because interest, as we've established, interest is pretty much a substitute for rent. So you're either paying interest to the bank or you're paying rent to a landlord, or a combination of both. Equally, it's important to remember that when you sell your house, if you're selling it to buy a new house, so let's say, the normal course of events over a person's life, you might start off with a studio flat and then a 1-bedroom flat and then a 2-bedroom flat, and then your family grows, and you might want to then buy a house, a 3-bedroom house, so you've got room for everybody, and then your kids eventually leave home, so you want to downsize, maybe back to a flat, and then ultimately you'll retire, and so you'll then move into a retirement type property. So over the course of time, every time you sell, although you've raised the amount of capital, you're selling in the market you're going to rebuy in. So now you're paying again at the higher price. So the way I express this is I say, in reality, equity growth is merely an inflation hedge rather than a capital gain. which opens up a whole interesting conversation around capital gains tax. And while I agree with the Green Party on their approach to equalizing capital gains tax with income tax, as long as they remember to include that there is a cost around the interest there is a cost of that capital gain, which is the interest. So as long as you can deduct the interest you might have paid on a mortgage from your capital gain before they calculate your tax, I'm all up for that. So that's house prices. How have we done as households? So in 2008, the average monthly earnings of an individual was 1,881, and by 2025, that's 3,176. So that sounds pretty good. That's gone up 69%, 4% per annum. It's okay, but importantly, it's less than how much houses have gone up. This is, again, another indicator of how the inflated demand is pushing the value of homes beyond the reach of more and more households. Because the income going into the home, so that 3,176, that's that income line, that's the salaries and wages that are on that economic flow model. Now, when I was doing economics, my professor said to me, what's worth bearing in mind is 2,000 years ago, if I had a 1 ounce golden Roman sovereign, 1 ounce of gold, back when gold was money, and I went to the finest tailor in all of Rome, and I bought myself a nice toga and a sash and the finest pair of sandals and got my hair cut and groomed and all the rest of it, that 1 ounce of gold would have paid for all of that. Now, interestingly, 2,000 years later, never mind the 14 years, 2008 to 2025, 2,000 years later, that same ounce of gold will buy pretty much the same thing. So for £3,000, you can go to spoiler, that's the current price of an ounce of gold. So for £3,000, you could go to the finest tailor in Milan and order yourself up a nice swish fancy suit and shirt and tie and nice pair of shoes and get your hair cut and all the rest of it for about the same amount of money. So what that shows you is that actually that ounce of gold, in terms of barter power, in terms of what I can exchange it for, has stayed exactly the same for 2,000 years. So now that we've established that, if gold is such a stable store of value, how does it work if we then look at the house price and the salaries in terms of an ounce of gold? Okay, so in 2008, an ounce of gold was £433. Today, it's $3,099 at the time of recording, which is the 21st of November, for your reference, 2025, depending on when you get to see this. So that's 616% in those 14 years. So that's 36% per annum. That, for me, is a reflection on the disparity between currency, so the pound, and gold. And there's a whole other conversation to be had about why that is. And that's maybe a topic for another video. But for now, let's just have a look. So in 2008, I would have had to spend 390. I would have had to use 390 of those coins to buy that house. If I sold it today, I'd only get 104 back. That's a 73% drop. So comparing one store of value, supposedly homes are a great asset to build wealth, I've actually lost 73%. And that's not even taking into account the £42,000 I paid in interest. So that ain't so good. And even for the households, we're not doing so much better either. So back in 2008, for a monthly wage, I would have received 4.4, say 4.5 gold coins. Here you go, clink, clink, clink. There's your salary. Today I'll just get just over 1. So click. That's pretty much along the same line, but obviously higher because we know that wages haven't caught up. So I was thinking about this and I was, okay, what's the best way to summarize this? And I think the easiest way to put it is that effectively, if we look at our value, the value of our labor and our value to an economy as a consumer in an economy, for every 100 units of effort that you put in, you're only getting 89 units back. And this is why we feel we are becoming poorer and why we actually are becoming poorer. Because the more we put in, the less we get back. And it's a feature, not a bug of the system. That is Western capitalism. So just for a bit of fun, let's have a look at something else. So The Economist magazine has an economic theory they call Bergonomics. And what they say is if you took a Big Mac, you bought it anywhere in the world, it's essentially the same product. That's the product promise that you get from McDonald's. So you'll get the same burger no matter where you go in the world. So if it's the same burger, and assuming it's remained exactly the same as it is today, then if we use Bergonomics rather than house prices, which can be subjective, and a burger is something most of us can afford, in 2008, a Big Mac, according to The Economist, was £2.29. Today, the average is £4.39. So that's gone up 92%. Now, if you remember, the house prices was 91%. So it's pretty much the same. So again, it's 5.4% versus 4% on the income that we've received over that period of time. So it's actually gone up in terms of my purchasing power. I have to work longer to afford that Big Mac than I used to. That's that 100 units versus 89. I'm losing 11 units. I have to work now 11 units longer before I can get to the 100 to buy that burger. And if we think about this in terms of gold, well, if I had an ounce of gold in 2008, I could have bought 189 Big Macs. Now I can buy 706. Now, I don't know who needs 189 or 706 Big Macs. Maybe this guy. We all know he loves a bit of McDonald's. But yeah, that was just for a bit of fun. But I think it serves a valuable lesson that gold as a store of value and as a representation of what things are worth, I think this speaks volumes in terms of where things are currently. Let's talk a little bit more about credit. So, as things currently stand, in order to either buy or rent a home in the UK, you have to have not only a good credit record, you have to just have a credit record, period. So if you're a young person, or if you're someone who lives debt-free and has never had any debt, you can't rent or buy because you have no credit record. If you have a bad credit record, you can't rent or buy either So what this means is that one of your primary basic needs as a human being, a home, hides behind a credit paywall. If you haven't ever gone into debt, what they're effectively doing is they're saying to you, you have to show us that you can borrow money and pay it back before we'll lend you money. Do you see how it's all a little bit weird? And once you've done that, so you have to be in debt to get into debt. The whole thing, credit is an absolutely dismal aspect of this. So bear that in mind. You cannot buy or rent a home in the UK if you don't have a credit record or if you have a bad credit record. So let's think about that bad credit record. If you were a homeowner and for whatever circumstance, you lost your job, circumstance, right? Things happen. If you defaulted on your home loan and the bank then sells your home from under you to recover its money, kicks you out, you now can't rent a home because you've got a bad credit record. So that is going to put people, or that does put people at risk of homelessness. Now, remember, we talked about when we were looking at the supply and demand curves, we talked about we need to build, baby, build. But again, according to the Office of National Statistics, in 2017, there were 605,891 vacant homes in England, and they class vacant as, or long-term vacants, which is properties that have been empty for over 6 months or more. 605,000, say 606,000 homes are empty. So there's not a shortage of actual items. What we have is what is very clearly manufactured scarcity in order to keep house prices high and to keep rents high. Someone, somewhere is tinkering in the back end of this capitalist system. They've got the bonnet up on and they're tinkering around in the engine, and they are manipulating house prices and rent prices by creating artificial scarcity. So they're limiting the supply, even though that we can access, even though that supply does exist. Now, you could argue a lot of it, especially in London, is probably owned by foreign people who are holding it because they know that there's this tinkering going on in the economy and that whatever else happens, the price is just going to keep going up. So it's a nice place to put my money. Contrast that with the same report said that there were at least 4,500 people. I say at least because how do you measure someone who's homeless? But there were at least 4,500 people sleeping rough on the streets of England in the same year. So that's basically each one of those homeless people could have 135 homes each. So tell me again there's lack of access to housing. Tell me again that we can't house homeless people. And this cuts to the core of Zach Polansky and the Green Party's message, which is it's about political choices. The Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Governor of the Bank of England are the two roles singularly responsible for the tinkering that's going on in the economy that's preventing us from being able to house everybody. And just as a basic baseline, the Labour Party are talking about a new renters bill and all the rest of it. But what they haven't put in there is they should make it illegal for a landlord to require a clean credit record to rent a home. What would be sufficient, or what should be sufficient, is what always was sufficient, which is that you have a reference. If your bank says, yes, you paid your mortgage for 15 years and then you lost your house because you lost your job, but yeah, you have a capacity to pay. So a reference from your bank, or if you've rented for 15 years and you've got letters from all of your landlords saying, yeah, this is a good person, they always pay on time, they're no problem, that should be enough. And it used to be enough. It's no longer enough. And that, again, is a political choice. They've allowed landlords to do this. And in doing that, they've excluded so many people. One of the biggest challenges that Rise, the charity that deals with women who are fleeing from domestic abuse situations, a lot of those women don't have credit records. Everything's been in their husband's name. That's the general nature of the abuser. They wouldn't let them have their own bank account or their own credit card. So one of the things that prevents them from leaving an abusive relationship is the fact that they can't go out and just rent somewhere. So they're forced to stay in situ in a dangerous situation. And this is exactly why this particular one simple thing that could be changed with no sweat to anybody needs to be done, and isn't being done even by this Labour government. And the Green Party will change that. Sorry for the rant there. So I often hear people, whenever I have this discussion around people who get into debt difficulties and stuff, and most people say, well, people shouldn't live beyond their means. But when you talk about means, if you're going to be literal about that, then you need to say, okay, my means are the amount of money I earn in my salary. Those are my means, genuinely. Means shouldn't include what else you can borrow. And the reality is, you can't buy a car, you can't buy a house. If you're a 19-year-old moving out of home for the first time and you need to furnish a flat, or even a bedroom in a flat somewhere, you're going to need to buy duvets and sheets and curtains and stuff. So it's almost impossible to get started without credit. And this is where the title of this episode comes from, which is what I call riding the tiger's back. Credit is the tiger. And as long as you stay on the tiger's back, you're fine. The minute you fall off, you get eaten by the tiger. And this is an old Chinese proverb, and it's called riding the tiger's back. So how many people are, or how close are you who's watching this to falling off the tiger's back? Well, according to research undertaken by Virgin Media O2, a survey of 2,000 of their employees, so these are employed people, amid the UK's cost of living crisis, finds 34% say they are living paycheck to paycheck. If they were to lose their job today, 56% couldn't afford basic utilities, 47% couldn't afford groceries, and 41% fear they'd go into debt, or maybe go into more debt, or maybe default on their debt. When I was a youngster, my dad, when I first started working, said to me, make sure you've always got 3 months net salary saved up in case you ever lose your job, because that should tide you through until you find another one. The way the job market is at the moment, I think you would need significantly more than 3 months stored away. And the reality is, how many of us with the current cost of living crisis can afford to save anything at all? So this is not really an argument that I'm willing to entertain from anybody if they say, well, you're just living beyond your means. Because taken literally, my means are what I can earn. If I could afford to survive on what I earn in my salary, then I agree with you 100%. But that is not the nature and the reality of our economic system. And if we just look at how egregious this is, in 2008, during the financial crisis, I was working for Barclays Bank, and I did a little calculation, and I worked out. So this would have been, I left actually in 2008 because I was so disgusted with the way they were behaving. By 2009, once the total cost of the government's intervention in bailing out the banks came to light, it was evident that the government could have given the entire UK population a 1-year income tax holiday, no income tax for a year, for less than the amount of money it stole from the Treasury to give to the banks. So think about that. If, let's say, you pay £600 a month tax, and you're struggling on your mortgage, so you're one of those people in the financial crisis where you were like, oh, I don't know how I'm going to be able to pay my mortgage. Well, if you had an extra £600, you could put that towards your mortgage. And if you were already doing okay, what are you going to do with that money? You're going to spend it. Spend, baby, spend. You would go on holiday, buy a new TV, upgrade your kitchen. Who knows? All of that creates economic activity. And that would have actually stimulated the economy back into a stable growth. But no, we bailed out the banks. And think about that. If I'm paying my mortgage, the bank wins. The banks would have won. The banks would have still got bailed out by default as a consequence, as a side benefit. They would have been able to, a lot of those mortgages that went delinquent would have been able to be serviced because households would have had just that little bit of extra money to help them get through. But no. We must bail out the corporations. Corporate socialism. Talk about that on the next slide. Basically, the whole 2008 financial crisis was predicted, was inevitable, and could have been handled far, far, far better than the way it was. So, thinking about credit, how dangerous is it really? So, I've talked about it being like a drug, okay? So, in their testimony to an inquiry into banking charges done by the South African government in 2008, Barclays Bank stated, credit cards are necessary because credit cards enable cardholders to make larger purchases than would otherwise have been the case. Oh, isn't that nice of them? Oh, bless their little hearts. The eventual outcome of the inquiry was that with credit cards, like a mirage, I love the way they put this, the interest-free period serves as an attraction to those credit card users who prove unable to repay timeously and who are thereby drawn more easily into higher interest-bearing debt, which is exactly why the bank gives you the credit card in the first place. Credit is a drug. The banks are the drug dealers. They make it so that it is impossible for you to exist in this society without having it. You can't rent a house, for heaven's sake, if you haven't had credit. If you've ever been unfortunate with your credit, you cannot rent a house. They are no better. Banks, credit card companies are no better than a backstreet drug dealer. But of course, these were the findings of the South African government in 2008. Yeah, well, that's the ANC. They're a bunch of Marxists. Well, it's not just them. And this has been known for a long time. Thomas Jefferson, 1776, one of the founders of America, baby, wrote, "I believe that banks are more dangerous to our civil liberties than standing armies. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them, the banks, will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered." I mean, he's only someone who was like a founding father of America. So why would we listen to him? But more dangerous to our civil liberties than standing armies? I wonder, is it the boats? Hold that thought. John Adams, classical economist, he wrote, also in the late 1700s, that all the perplexities, confusion, and distress in America arise not from defects of the Constitution, not from want of honor or virtue, so much as from downright ignorance of the nature of coin, credit, and circulation. Perplexities, confusion, and distress, more dangerous than standing armies. I don't think it's these boats that are the problem. I think it's these boats that are the problem. And if you watch my other video on the economic flow model, I make exactly the same point. It's not homeless people. Sorry, it's not immigrants. It's not refugees. It's not trans people. For heaven's sake. It's the have-yots. And the rest of us are have-nots. So what do you do about this? So there is a concept which is known as a debt jubilee. And the idea with this is that on a cyclical period, all debts are wiped clean. And this might sound like some newfangled socialism type thing. Oh, Julie, you're a socialist. Of course, you just want money for free and all the rest of it. Interestingly, Iceland, the only country that actually imprisoned bankers for the 2008 financial crisis, are actually experimenting with the observance of this type of debt forgiveness. But it's not just them. The Bible, the book of Leviticus, God counsels Moses to forgive debts in certain cases every Jubilee year. So in the Bible, it talks about at the end of Shemitah, which, depending on interpretation, is either every 7 years or every 49 years. The same theme was found in the Hittite text entitled The Song of Debt Release. Ancient Athens had a form of debt release. And even Islam, the Quran, supports debt forgiveness. Remember this guy? So all of you right-wing Christian nationalists, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. What do you think this guy would say about it? Beyond this, though, we're often told that communism failed. So communism was socialism, which it wasn't. But regardless of that, they'll say, oh, it failed. It's a failed economic model. Well, in truth, capitalism fell in 2008. And there are even some thinkers on this, some economists are saying capitalism actually fell when Nixon took us off the gold standard back in the 1970s. That was actually everything that's happened since then. Is effectively what we did is we gave the banks and the corporations the ability to create money, and by doing that, have sown the seeds. That it used to be, if you had a $1 bill, I used to say, I promise to pay bearer on demand $1 worth of gold, and you could go in and exchange that for the approximate value of gold. We don't have that anymore. They can just print as much as they want, and as I said, I think that where money comes from is a discussion I can have going forward. It's probably an hour all by itself. But within our lifetime of forget Nixon, 2008 was definitely. We're always told free market capitalism is only the fit survive, survival of the fittest. If this is true, then we should have just taken the hit in 2008 and let the system unwind itself. Everything that's happened since then and will continue to happen can be linked back to then. And this is corporate socialism. This is the privatization of profit and the socialization of loss. So we have socialism already. It's just not to the benefit of the households. It's to the benefit of the businesses, the corporations, the wealthy, and the elite. And interestingly, it's the same thing with communism. The reason communism failed is that the top became bloated and top heavy. So if you lived in the USSR and you were a commissar, or you were high in the government, or you were connected and ran one of their oil companies, you were fine under communism. There was even in East Germany, there was a special shop where you could buy all the Western goods you ever wanted. There was another one in Moscow. But you had to pay in foreign currency. So if you were wealthy and rich, communism worked just fine for them. And like now, in the Western civilization, the same group of people are benefiting. And in closing, I would just say, in its wake, just like with communism in the Soviet Union, only the banks, elites, and mega wealthy have benefited, whilst the people are left homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. Thank you for watching, and I hope you made it to the end of this. I keep hoping I can do these things in half-hour slots, but I think to really get into the meat of everything, it's important to try to explain all of these concepts. There is a paper I wrote that's connected to this. So I'll put in the description a link to my Substack, where you can read this, where you can also find the previous episode. I will put these on YouTube, but it's worth bearing in mind if you go to the Substack, I don't charge you to join my Substack. It's free. And you won't get irritating ads, which sort of defeats the purpose, doesn't it? So I'm socializing this for free. I don't make anything out of this. I just really feel this is an important message. If you like the message, please subscribe to my Substack. As I said, it's free. You can also find me on YouTube. I'll put the links up here. You can also email me if you want to get into a conversation about this. But otherwise, thank you very much for your time, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.